The call came during Dr. Harlan Voss's lecture on xenochemistry, the same way all the worst things in Harlan's life arrived, without ceremony, wedged between two ordinary moments so that you didn't recognize the before and after until it was too late to go back. He was writing a molecular diagram on the board, the kind that graduate students copied down with their heads tilted and their pens moving slow, when his wristcom gave a single low pulse. Not a call, not a message, a frequency signature he hadn't heard in 14 months, the specific harmonic that the Interstellar Coalition's Deep Access Division used when they didn't want anyone to know they were contacting you. Harlan finished the diagram, capped his marker, told his 31 students that class was over early, enjoy the afternoon, and walked out before any of them could ask why his face had gone the color of old chalk. He was 24 years old. He'd been expelled from the Coalition Academy 18 months ago for running an unauthorized experiment in atmospheric reconfiguration, specifically for cracking open a sealed Section 9 containment protocol to test a theory his professors told him was a waste of lab time. The experiment had worked. The professors had not forgiven him for that. He'd been stripped of his provisional field certification, assigned to an adjunct teaching post at Callaway University's off-world campus on Titan Station, and handed a polite letter suggesting he keep his head down. He kept his head down for exactly 11 months. Then he started the experiment again in his apartment with equipment he built from parts he wasn't supposed to have. He answered the frequency signal in the corridor outside his classroom, standing against the wall with students drifting past him, and the voice on the other end was Commander Pillar Osai, who had personally signed his expulsion order. "Voss," she said with no preamble, "something's been taken from the Meridian Array. We need you." He thought about saying no. He thought about it for the length of time it took 3 students to pass him in the corridor and one of them to wave goodbye. Then he said, "Send me the file." The file arrived 40 seconds later. He read it walking to the transport bay, the contents lighting up the inside of his head in slow, bright increments of dread. The Meridian Array was the Coalition's most secure xenobiological research installation, a deep space platform orbiting Theta Cygni, staffed by 42 scientists, guarded by a full security rotation, and designed to be as close to airtight as human engineering could manage. 3 days ago, someone had cut through the perimeter security on Lab Sector 7, killed the 2 researchers on night duty, and walked out with 4 containment vials from E-Laboratory. 3 of the vials held a compound called Veritoxin 9, a synthesized nerve agent that oxidized in oxygen-rich atmospheres within 6 hours, which meant it was lethal in deployment but self-neutralizing. A weapon, yes, but a bounded one. Coalition doctrine classified it as dangerous but manageable. The 4th vial was something else. The 4th vial held a biological agent that the Array's chief researcher, a Velhari xenobiologist named Dr. Senavral, had spent 9 years developing not as a weapon, but as a proof of concept for adaptive cell bonding therapies. The agent was a modified retroviral strand capable of bonding to the cellular respiration process of any carbon-based life form, and in its current unmodified state, interrupting it permanently. It had no antidote. It had no oxidation window. Released in sufficient quantity into a closed atmospheric system, a colony dome, a station, a planet with a breathable envelope, it would kill everything that breathed. The Array staff called it the null strain. The file did not tell Harlan who had stolen it. It told him that Coalition intelligence had a strong lead, that the theft bore the operational signature of a Velhari separatist faction called the Garadkes, extremists who believed the Coalition's expansion into Velhari space was an act of cultural genocide and had been escalating their tactics for 3 years. The last confirmed Garadkes action had been the bombing of a Coalition terraforming rig above Kenna 4. 8 people dead. Before that, a data hub sabotage that disrupted navigation signals for a month. This was not sabotage. This was a weapon capable of ending civilization. The file also contained a secondary note, appended in Commander Osai's personal cipher. It read, "Dr. Vral's daughter was aboard the array as a research intern. She is missing. Intelligence believes she was taken." Harlan stared at that line for a long time. He had met Lyra Vral exactly once, at a coalition academic conference on Titan Station 8 months ago, where she had sat in the back of a hall during his unauthorized guest lecture on atmospheric reconfiguration, and asked the only question that showed she'd actually understood what he was saying. She was 21. She had her mother's precision, and something in her eyes that her mother didn't have, a kind of clear, undeceived patience, as if she had already weighed the weight of things and decided to carry them anyway. He boarded the transport. Commander Osai met him at the Coalition's Regional Operations Hub on Europa Station, in a room that smelled of recycled air and anxiety, surrounded by people who were being very careful not to look at him. She was a tall woman with close-cropped hair, and the unhurried movements of someone who had spent decades being the most competent person in every room she entered. She did not apologize for the expulsion. He did not expect her to. "The Garadkes have issued a demand," she said, pulling up a holographic display. "They want the Coalition to withdraw all personnel and infrastructure from 7 Velhari star systems within 48 hours, and issue a formal declaration that the systems constitute sovereign Velhari space, non-negotiable, non-extendable. And if the Coalition doesn't comply, they'll release the null strain into the atmospheric envelope of Kenna Prime." Kenna Prime, population 1.3 million, mostly human colonists, some Velhari, all of them breathing the same air. "We have 46 hours, Osai said. "Coalition Command is not going to accept the demand. They will also not announce that publicly, because doing so would cause a panic. We have a narrow window to locate the Garadkes cell, retrieve the vials, and, if possible, recover Dr. Vral's daughter. And you need me because 14 months ago, you cracked a Section 9 containment protocol that 3 of our senior engineers said was uncrackable, and you did it in 11 hours using lab equipment that wasn't rated for the task." She looked at him with the particular expression of someone who is annoyed by the thing they are praising. "The null strain is contained in a Velhari-manufactured biolock, a crystalline lattice containment system that generates its own seal integrity through a resonant frequency cascade. Our engineers have never seen one. You have. You studied Velhari crystalline architecture in your own time, which is not something we asked you to do, but is apparently something you did anyway." "Because it was interesting," Harlan said. "Yes, well, that's going to be useful today." The intelligence lead was a Velhari defector named Castle, a former Garadkes logistics runner who had decided 3 years ago that he wanted out, and had spent the intervening time quietly feeding fragments of information to Coalition intelligence in exchange for a new identity. Castle was a slight, gray-scaled being with large amber eyes, and the habit of tapping 3 fingers against his thigh when he was choosing his words carefully, which was most of the time. He met Harlan in a side room with no windows, carrying a mug of something that smelled like fermented plant matter, and regarded Harlan the way most Velhari regarded humans, with the particular wariness of someone who has heard the stories but hasn't decided yet whether to believe them. "The cell is led by a commander named Kale Dross," Castle said. "I haven't seen him in 2 years. The last location I had was a decommissioned ore processing platform in the debris field above Cygni B. It was a staging point then. I don't know if it's still active." "What about the girl?" Harlan asked. Castle's fingers tapped. "She would be useful to them as leverage. Dr. Vral is the null strain's only creator. If the Coalition moves against the cell, Vral would be less likely to assist in developing a countermeasure while her daughter is in Garadkes' hands." He paused. "I should tell you, Kale Dross is not a fool. He is not an idealist either, not anymore. He became something harder when the rig bombing didn't produce the result he expected. He will use the null strain if he decides the math favors it. Harlan nodded slowly. He was thinking about the biolock, about crystalline lattice resonance, about the specific problem of neutralizing something that generated its own seal integrity, and what you would need to do to interrupt the cascade from the outside, and whether the tools on a coalition scout ship would be anywhere close to sufficient. He was also thinking, with a persistence he could not entirely explain, about a woman sitting in the back of a lecture hall and asking a question that suggested she had understood something most people in that room had missed. The scout ship was called the Terran IV, crewed by 4 coalition operatives, and one very quiet pilot who flew like the ship was an extension of her own nervous system. Harlan sat in the forward cargo bay for most of the 6-hour burn to Cygni 8B, surrounded by equipment cases, running calculations on a handheld unit, and occasionally eating crackers from a ration pack, with the mechanical attention of someone who has forgotten that eating is a thing they enjoy. One of the operatives, a broad-shouldered woman named Rook, who had the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times before and only found it moderately interesting, sat across from him on a crate and watched him work without speaking, which Harlan appreciated. After about 3 hours, she said, "You know they don't actually expect you to retrieve the vials." Harlan looked up. "What do they expect?" "They expect you to confirm what's in the biolock and give us a shot window when we can breach without triggering a release. Then they call in a heavy response team and we pull back." "What about the girl?" Rook's expression didn't change exactly, but something in it shifted slightly, the way a door shifts when the building settles. "Secondary objective." Harlan went back to his calculations. Rook watched him for another minute and then went to check her gear. The ore platform was exactly as ugly as its description suggested, a sprawling, corroded structure about the size of a city block, anchored in the outer ring of the debris field, where Cygni 8B's gravity kept a slow carousel of rock and ice moving in lazy ellipses. The Terran IV matched velocity and went dark 3 kilometers out, running on passive systems, and they watched the platform through the optical sensors for 2 hours. There were 12 Geradkes operatives, by Rook's count, armed, alert, distributed across the platform in a pattern that suggested professional training. 2 of them ran overlapping exterior patrols. The interior was harder to read, thermal signatures through the hull, blurred by the platform's own systems, but Harlan counted at least 3 distinct clusters of heat that suggested people in enclosed spaces. The biolock signal was unmistakable once you knew what to look for. It pulsed at 12.7 kilohertz, a standing resonance wave that Harlan could see on the ship's sensor display like a slow, patient heartbeat. It was coming from deep inside the platform's central processing core, the most defensible position on the structure. "There's a secondary heat signature," Harlan said, pointing at the display. "Here, separated from the main group in what looks like a storage section on the port side. 1 person, low movement." "Could be a guard," Rook said. "Guards don't stay in one place for 2 hours." Rook looked at the signature for a long moment. "All right, what's your read on the biolock?" Harlan had spent 3 hours running the numbers. The crystalline lattice used a resonant cascade. Each layer of the seal triggered the next, so that a physical breach without first interrupting the cascade would shatter the innermost containment vessel before you could reach it. The cascade ran in a predictable sequence, though, because crystalline lattice systems were designed for reliability, and reliability required regularity. If you could introduce a counter-frequency at the right point in the sequence, you could interrupt the cascade long enough to open the outer seal cleanly. The right frequency was 8.4 kilohertz. The tool Harlan would need to generate it was not in the equipment cases on the Terran IV. It was in the partially disassembled atmospheric reconfiguration device currently sitting in 3 boxes in his Titan Station apartment, which he had built from parts he wasn't supposed to have. He told Rook this. She stared at him for a very long time. I can improvise the component, he said. I need about 40 minutes and access to your ship's calibration kit. The signal team is due in 4 hours, Rook said. If we're going in ahead of them, we do it now or not at all. Then I need to start now. He built the counter-frequency emitter on the floor of the Terran IV's forward cargo bay in 37 minutes, using calibration tools, a salvaged communications module, a piece of sensor array cabling he'd rerouted, and a considerable amount of focused concentration. Rook watched him the way people watch someone defuse something, very still, very quiet, not breathing particularly deeply. When he finished and the unit hummed to life on the correct frequency, she exhaled slowly through her nose and said, "Huh. Does that mean you're impressed? That means I'm less likely to die today than I was 30 minutes ago." She stood up and clipped her sidearm. "Let's go." They went in through an emergency access hatch on the platform's lower hull, the kind that maintenance crews used in the days when the platform was a functioning industrial operation, and no one had yet decided to use it as a base for bioterrorism. The hatch seal was old and complained about it but yielded. The inside of the platform smelled of metal and the particular chemical undertone of Velhari life support systems. A faint, sharp sweetness, like something organic being kept just barely warm. The first guard they encountered was at the junction of 2 corridors about 40 meters in. Rook handled it with the efficient precision of someone who had done the math beforehand and found a clean solution. Harlan stepped over the unconscious figure and kept moving. He took a left at the junction, heading toward the portside storage section. Rook caught his arm. "That's not the biolock." "I know," Harlan said. She held his arm for a moment. He met her eyes. Something passed between them that wasn't quite an argument, more like 2 people rapidly calculating whether the deviation was survivable and arriving at different answers. 5 minutes, Rook said, letting go. The storage section was 3 corridors away. The door was sealed from the outside with a simple magnetic lock, the kind that expressed contempt for its own prisoner rather than serious security measures. Harlan had it open in 40 seconds with a bypass tool from Rook's kit. The space inside was small and cold. A former equipment locker converted to a cell with neither comfort nor malice, just indifference. Lyra Vral was sitting on the floor with her back against the far wall and her knees drawn up, and when the door opened, she looked up with the expression of someone who has decided not to startle because startling costs energy. She is conserving for something more important. She looked at Harlan. He was aware, briefly and inconveniently, that the last time he had seen her, she had been wearing a conference badge and asking him a question about atmospheric molecular bonding. And now she was wearing a bloodied sleeve and looking at him with amber-gray eyes that had decided, in the time it took her to process what she was seeing, to remain calm. "You're Voss," she said, "from the lecture." "Yes," he said, "we need to move." "The vials," she said, standing. She moved carefully, her left side was hurt, he could see it in the set of her shoulders. "My mother's biolock, do you know how to open it?" "That's where I'm going next." She looked at Rook, then back at him. "I'm coming." "You're not," Rook started. "My mother spent 9 years building the null strain as a medical tool," Lyra said, with a precision that was completely unmistakable. She built a failsafe into the crystalline lattice, a second-order frequency interrupt that will collapse the containment vessel safely if triggered correctly. The Garadkes don't know it exists. My mother told me the frequency 2 years ago and made me memorize it. She looked at Harlan. "I suspect you've been trying to calculate the counter-frequency from first principles." 8.4 kilohertz, Harlan said. 8.4 is the primary interrupt. The secondary failsafe runs at 11.1. If you trigger the primary interrupt and the containment vessel detects a breach attempt without the secondary, it collapses the outer seal and you're back to ground zero. She tilted her head slightly. "Did you know that?" Harlan thought about his 37-minute build, about the single frequency emitter currently clipped to his belt, about what would have happened when he reached the biolock and triggered 8.4 without knowing about the secondary. "I do now," he said. They moved. The central processing core was 2 levels up and deep into the platform's interior, which meant moving through territory that was progressively more occupied by people who wanted to kill them. Rook navigated it with a controlled economy that Harlan found genuinely impressive. She used the platform's own infrastructure, the maintenance corridors behind the main passages, the blind spots that any structure develops when its builders care more about industrial access than security. She moved like she'd studied the platform's schematics for years, though Harlan suspected it was more that she'd spent enough time in enough places like this that they all had the same grammar. They encountered 3 more guards. They went through 2 of them the same way they'd gone through the first. The third was more alert, and the situation became briefly complicated in a way that involved a gravity fluctuation in the corridor, a standard platform malfunction, the kind that happened when old stabilizer systems hiccuped, and Harlan using the moment of disorientation to do something that was not elegant but was effective. The guard ended up on the floor. Harlan's left hand was going to bruise significantly. He noticed, as they moved through the core approach corridor, that Lyra had not once needed to be told to keep low, keep quiet, or move when he moved. She did all 3 automatically, with the attentive economy of someone whose mind was working on multiple problems simultaneously and treating physical navigation as the least interesting of them. The biolock chamber was at the heart of the processing core, a room that had been retrofitted for the purpose, stripped of its original equipment, and rebuilt around a single pedestal in the center where the containment assembly sat. The pedestal was surrounded by 3 Garadkes operatives and Kaeldros himself. Harlan had been briefed on Kaeldros. The briefing documents described a dedicated extremist, a former Coalition liaison officer who had witnessed Coalition contractors demolishing a Velhari ancestral site to make room for a processing station, and had come back from that experience carrying something that hadn't been there before. Harlan could see the truth of that in the way Kaeldros stood beside the containment assembly, not with the tensed urgency of a man about to do something he feared, but with the careful stillness of someone who had already done the hardest thing in his own mind and was simply waiting for the physical world to catch up. He was also, at this particular moment, watching the door of the biolock chamber through which Harlan, Rook, and Lyra had just entered via a maintenance access panel in the far wall that the Garadkes had not thought to cover, because most people didn't know it existed. Most people had not spent 2 days on Titan Station reading structural schematics of decommissioned Velhari mining platforms, because they found them interesting. The next 30 seconds were fast and loud and involved decisions being made in the compressed time frame that only becomes available when everything unnecessary has been stripped away and you are working with pure necessity. Rook moved left. Harlan moved right. The 3 operatives responded to Rook because she was the obvious threat. Kaeldros reached for the containment assembly. What happened next was something Harlan had not planned, because planning would have required knowing that Lyra Vral, moving with her hurt left side and her clear, undeceived patience, would step directly toward Kaeldros and speak to him in Velhari. He caught about a third of it. His Velhari was functional but not fluent. She was not threatening him. She was talking to him, in the way you talk to someone when you believe they are still inside their decisions and haven't become something else entirely. She said her mother's name. She said the word that meant, roughly, the work a life is for. She said something about the ancestral site that Harlan couldn't follow. Kaeldros looked at her. His hand was on the containment assembly. The chamber was very quiet behind the sounds of Rook efficiently solving the problem of the 3 operatives. He said something back to Lyra. Harlan caught only the last part, a phrase that translated approximately as "we do not get to want the same world." Lyra said quietly in Standard, "Then let us build different ones." It was not enough to stop him. Harlan had not expected it to be enough. What it was enough for was a 3-second window in which Dross was focused on Lyra, and in those 3 seconds Harlan covered the distance to the pedestal, pulled the emitter from his belt, and held it against the resonant surface of the containment assembly. He triggered 8.4. The crystalline lattice pulsed. He felt it through the emitter, a vibration that traveled up through his hand and into the bones of his arm, regular and precise, the cascade beginning to interrupt. The outer seal began to open. 11.1, Lyra said. She was right beside him now. Now. He dialed the emitter to 11.1 and triggered the secondary. The lattice went quiet. The cascade collapsed cleanly, all the way down to the innermost vessel, and the containment assembly unlocked with the sound of something that had been wound very tight finally finding its resting state. Dross moved. Rook was faster. The chamber settled back into its new configuration. 3 unconscious operatives, 1 secured Garadkes commander, 4 intact containment vials, and 2 people standing over a pedestal in a room that smelled of mineral dust and the particular aftermath of things that almost happened. Harlan looked at the vials for a moment. 4 small cylinders, each no longer than his thumb, each containing either a bounded weapon or an extinction-level agent. The difference between them was invisible to the eye. It lived entirely in the 9 years of a scientist's work and the knowledge her daughter had memorized. He carefully placed all 4 vials into the transport case from Rook's kit. "We're right back where we started," he said, not to anyone in particular, just the reflex of a mind that processes release through understatement. Lyra looked at him with her amber-gray eyes. "Not quite," she said. The extraction was not simple. The Garadkes operatives they hadn't encountered on the way in had apparently noticed that several of their colleagues were no longer responding, and there was a period of approximately 15 minutes during which the 3 of them moved through the platform at a pace that left no room for anything but movement. Rook burned through 2 more encounters. Lyra navigated from memory through maintenance corridors she had apparently been studying during her captivity. She had found a platform schematic in a forgotten maintenance tablet in her cell and spent 40 hours memorizing it. "In case I needed to get out," she said simply when Harlan mentioned it. They reached the emergency access hatch. The Terran IV was exactly where they had left it, which was one of the few things that had gone according to any plan today. The pilot had them away from the platform and into clear space before the remaining Garadkes operatives reached the exterior, and then they were moving, and the platform was falling away behind them in the sensor display. Commander Osai's response team arrived 6 hours later, took custody of Dross and the 3 operatives, secured the platform, and began the process of unraveling the Garadkes network through the threads that Dross, now in custody and facing the weight of what he had actually been prepared to do, was reluctantly beginning to provide. The null-strain vials were returned to Dr. Senavral aboard a coalition medical courier. The doctor did not speak to Harlan directly, but she sent a message through Osai's secure channel that consisted of 14 technical questions about atmospheric molecular bonding, the most complex questions anyone had ever sent him, which he understood to be a form of acknowledgement from someone who expressed gratitude in the language they trusted most. Harlan spent the return journey in the Terran IV's forward cargo bay, eating crackers and running calculations, because the experience of nearly dying had clarified several things about his research that had been resisting clarification, and he wanted to get them down before the clarity faded. Lyra Vral was sitting across from him. They had been talking, on and off, for about 3 hours, the way people talk when they have recently been through something extraordinary and are in the process of determining what ordinary looks like on the other side of it. She had questions about the counter-frequency, emitter precise, specific questions that told him she had understood its function from watching him use it, and was working through the theoretical implications. He had questions about the crystalline lattice failsafe, and about Velhari biochemistry more generally, and about 3 things she had said to Kaldros that he hadn't fully understood. The phrase about the ancestral site, he said. The third part, I couldn't catch it. I told him that my mother has spent 9 years trying to create something that heals, Lyra said. That she built the null strains cure into its own architecture, not as a weapon control measure, but because she believes anything powerful enough to destroy must also carry the possibility of repair, or it has no right to exist. She paused. It didn't stop him, but I think it reached something. Harlan thought about Kaldros's face in those 3 seconds. About the specific quality of stillness in a person who has heard something true they weren't expecting to hear. Maybe, he said, you were right that it was worth trying. Were you afraid I was wrong? I was afraid you were going to keep trying for longer than 3 seconds. She made a small sound that was possibly a laugh, or possibly just acknowledgement. Your timing was good. Your timing was better. You knew when to hold him and when to stop. He looked at her. Where did you learn that? From my mother. She spent her career in rooms full of people who believe that what they're building is justified by what it will accomplish. You have to be able to reach them before they finish building it. She tilted her head. You do something similar. I build things, Harlan said. You build things that other people have decided can't be built. That requires the same skill. You have to hold open the possibility that the problem is solvable for long enough that the solution has room to appear. She considered. I watched your lecture. You spent 40 minutes holding open a possibility that 3 professors had declared closed. The students in that room left believing something different than they'd believed when they arrived. Harlan had not thought about his lecture in quite that way. He thought about it now. They expelled me for it, he said. Yes, and then they called you back when they needed the thing they'd expelled you for. She said it without judgment, as a fact, observed and set down cleanly. That seems like information. It did, Harlan thought. It was the kind of information that changed the shape of things, not dramatically, not with a pivot or a reversal, but with the quiet persistence of water finding a crack and deciding to become a river. Commander Oz, I said something about reinstating my field certification, he said. After, if the mission was successful. And I haven't decided whether I want it. Lyra looked at him. What do you want? He thought about the emitter he'd built in 37 minutes on the floor of a cargo bay. About the crystalline lattice architecture he'd studied on his own time because it was interesting. About the way Lyra had taken the information he'd provided in the moment he'd provided it and integrated it without hesitation, as if the gap between knowing something and using it was a distinction she had never fully recognized. I want to know what your mother put in the null strain as a repair mechanism, he said. The biochemistry of a retroviral strand that can interrupt cellular respiration, the inverse process, a strand that could repair cellular respiration damage. That's a treatment pathway for about 9 distinct conditions that we currently manage but can't cure. Lyra was quiet for a moment. My mother has been trying to find a partner to develop that pathway for 3 years. The Coalition's Medical Research Division told her it wasn't commercially viable. The Coalition's Medical Research Division also told me atmospheric reconfiguration wasn't theoretically possible. Yes, Lyra said, I noticed. They flew on through the dark between stars. The Terran IV's drive burning steady and blue behind them, and the transport case sat in the cargo bay between their feet, and the 4 small vials inside it held either catastrophe or medicine, depending on what people decided to do next, which was always the way of it. Titan Station came up on the sensors 3 hours out, a cluster of lights against the amber bands of Saturn's upper atmosphere, and Harlan sat back in his crate and looked at it, and tried to determine whether the shape of his future had changed, or whether he was simply seeing it from a different angle. Rook appeared in the cargo bay doorway. leaned against the frame, and looked at the two of them with an expression of someone arriving at a conclusion they consider adequately supported. "Osai wants a full debrief on arrival," she said. "Both of you. She also wants your field certification paperwork signed, Voss. Something about not wanting to have this conversation again at a worse moment." Harlan said nothing. Rook looked at him for another moment. "The platform structural schematic you used to find the maintenance panel," she said. "That's not in any coalition database. Where did you get it?" "I found it in an archive of decommissioned Velhari industrial documentation. About 8 months ago. I was reading about crystalline architecture and followed a tangent." Rook absorbed this. "You read industrial archive documentation for fun." "I find it interesting." She made a sound that was indistinguishable from the sound Lyra had made earlier and went back forward. Lyra said she's impressed. She said the same thing about the emitter. She meant it then too. Titan Station grew larger in the viewport, and the pilot brought them in on a long, smooth arc. And Harlan thought about 14 months of keeping his head down, and what it had produced, the rebuilt device in its 3 boxes, the archive of decommissioned schematics, the calculations that were now 3 pages further along than they'd been when he left. He thought about the 14 months before the expulsion, the professors telling him his theory was a waste of lab time, the 11 hours it had taken him to crack a containment protocol, and the expression on their faces when it worked. He thought about the specific feeling of a problem yielding, not violently, not triumphantly, but with the clean, quiet release of a crystalline lattice finding its resting state. He thought about Lyra Vral asking him one question at the back of a lecture hall, and the shape of the questions she'd asked him in the last 3 hours, and the way she talked about her mother's work as though research was a kind of conversation you were having with the world about what was possible. The transport case was between his feet. In it, 4 vials. One of them the compressed end of 9 years of work that might, in different hands and with different intent, become the beginning of something else entirely. The research partnership, he said, the repair pathway. If your mother is interested in a collaborator who doesn't have any institutional backing or officially valid field certification, she would be extremely interested, Lyra said. She's been waiting for someone who reads decommissioned structural schematics for enjoyment. She says those are the people who find the things everyone else misses. Harlan looked out at Titan Station, close enough now that he could see the individual habitation rings rotating slowly in the dark, the lights of 60,000 lives moving through their ordinary moments, unaware that 46 hours ago a small cylinder in a decommissioned ore platform had been sitting at the threshold between their world and its end. "All right," he said. "All right," Lyra agreed. Titan Station received them at Docking Bay 7, which was the same bay Harlan had departed from approximately 18 hours ago, in the same clothes, carrying the same uncertainty about the future that he'd been carrying for 14 months. The uncertainty was still there. It had changed shape, the way things change shape when you've moved relative to them, and can finally see the profile that was always there but wasn't visible from the previous angle. Commander Osai was waiting at the bay entrance with 2 aides, a medical team, and an expression that said she had prepared a speech and was deciding whether to give it. She looked at Harlan, then at Lyra, then at the transport case. She did not give the speech. "Debriefing room 2, she said. 30 minutes. The medical team took Lyra first, her left side, which turned out to be 2 cracked ribs and a deep tissue bruise rather than the fracture Harlan had suspected, which was a small mercy in an accounting full of larger ones. Harlan sat in the corridor outside the medical bay with his back against the wall and his hands on his knees, listening to the station's ventilation systems move air through the passages, and thinking about nothing in particular with the focused attention of a man who is actually thinking about several things at once. Rook sat down next to him. She had a cup of something from the station's dispenser that she offered him without comment. He took it. It was hot and had the approximate flavor of coffee as imagined by a process that had only heard coffee described. You could have followed protocol, Rook said. Go to the biolock, confirm the signal, pull back and wait. I know, Harlan said. Instead, you built a counter-frequency emitter in 37 minutes, located a missing person using a maintenance access panel you found in an 8-month-old archive read, and navigated a live extraction with a wounded civilian who turned out to have the second-order interrupt frequency memorized. The extraction would have failed without her, Harlan said. Yes, Rook looked straight ahead. That's the part that none of the debrief notes are going to properly capture. Harlan thought about 11.1 kilohertz. About what would have happened at the biolock with only 8.4. About the 3 seconds that Lyra's conversation had bought, which were precisely the 3 seconds required. She earned it, he said. She did. Rook stood up, finished her dispenser drink, and looked down at him with the expression of someone who has completed a calculation they started a while ago. For what it's worth, she said, you're better in the field than the record suggests. Harlan said nothing because there wasn't anything to say to that. Rook left. He sat in the corridor and thought about work. 2 weeks later, he was in his apartment on Titan Station. The same apartment, the same 3 boxes of equipment components, the same calculations on the same board, and the board had more on it now, considerably more, because Dr. Senna Vral had answered his 14-question reply to her 14-question message, and the exchange had been going on for 11 days, and was showing no signs of resolution, which was the best possible sign. His provisional field certification, reinstated, signed, filed, was sitting in its folder on the corner of his desk. He had looked at it twice. On his workbench, the counter-frequency emitter he'd built on the Terran IV's cargo floor sat next to a newer version he'd been refining, cleaner, more precise, capable of dual-frequency output, and a variable cascade interrupt that would make it useful for applications well beyond decommissioned ore platforms. He was fairly confident it was also the core component of the cellular repair mechanism that Senna Vral had been trying to design for 3 years. The door signal chimed. He opened it. Lyra Vral was standing in the corridor with a datapad in one hand, and the particular expression of someone who has arrived with a specific purpose and does not intend to be distracted from it. My mother wants to move the collaboration to a formal structure, she said. She has access to a research facility on Callaway Station. She'd like to present the repair pathway findings to the Coalition Medical Board in 4 months. She looked past him at the board. You've been running the cellular interface calculations. I've been running them for 2 days. I know. She sent me the communication logs. Lyra stepped past him into the apartment without being invited, in the manner of someone who has decided this is no longer a threshold that requires ceremony. She looked at the workbench, at the emitter, at the board. You'll need to reconstruct your atmospheric reconfiguration work to get the frequency cascade calibration right. I already have. He pointed at the 3rd box. I rebuilt it last week. Lyra picked up the emitter, the new version, the refined one, and turned it in her hands with the careful attention of someone reading an object's intention. This is the repair mechanism delivery system, she said. It was not a question. If the cellular interface calculations are right, which I think they are. She set it down, looked at him with her amber-gray eyes, which had the same quality they'd had in the lecture hall and the locker room cell and the biolock chamber, that clear, undeceived patience that seemed to be her natural state, as though she had taken the measure of things and found them manageable. 4 months, she said, Coalition Medical Board. Formal collaboration. I heard you. Are you going to say yes? Harlan looked at the board, at the 3 boxes, at the emitter on the workbench and the certified folder in the corner, and the 14 pages of calculations that had accumulated over the last 2 weeks of conversations with a scientist who expressed gratitude in technical questions. He thought about a lecture hall, about a question from the back row, about a problem held open long enough for the solution to find its shape. "Yes," he said. Lyra nodded once with the satisfaction of someone who has confirmed a measurement they already expected. She set the datapad on his workbench next to the emitter, her mother's preliminary cellular interface proposal, 38 pages, dense with math, and turned to go. At the door she stopped. "The frequency you used on the bio-lock," she said, without turning around. 8.4 primary, 11.1 secondary. You calculated 8.4 from first principles in 37 minutes. "Yes." "What would have happened if I hadn't been there to give you 11.1? Harlan thought about it honestly. The outer seal would have opened. The containment vessel would have detected a breach without the secondary interrupt and collapsed. He paused. The null strain would have been released into the chamber. "And you would have been in the chamber?" "Yes." Lyra turned around. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that had something new in it, not the clear patience, or not only that. Something that had decided to be present, without deciding what to do with its presence yet. "Don't do that again," she said. "I'll try not to," Harlan said. She left. He stood in his apartment with the datapad on his workbench and the board full of calculations, and the 3 boxes of equipment, and the certified folder in the corner. And outside, the viewport Titan station turned slowly in the amber light of Saturn, and everything was more or less the same as it had been except that it wasn't, and that was, he thought, information. He sat down at his workbench, opened the 38-page proposal, and got to work.